Sarah, 24. While my dad was laughing at me for wasting my life studying 9 languages, my commanding officer called him. I watched the color drain from his face as a 3-star general told him his disappointment daughter was about to save American lives overseas. You see, for years, my military hero father, a decorated Army colonel, treated me like the family failure. While my Navy SEAL brother got praise and my parents bragged about their service, I was the soft one hiding behind books. Dad would mock me at family gatherings, telling his officer friends how I was playing with foreign gibberish instead of serving my country like a real patriot. What he didn't know? 6 months earlier, I'd secretly enlisted in the military's most elite intelligence unit, one that desperately needed someone fluent in Arabic, Mandarin, Russian, Farsi, Korean, Spanish, French, German, and Portuguese. While Dad thought I was still wasting time in college, I was actually undergoing classified training for a mission that would make his 20-year career look like basic training. The phone call that changed everything happened during our weekly family dinner, right as Dad launched into his usual speech about my worthless degree, but this time I wasn't going to take it. This isn't a happy story, but it's mine. Let me know if you've lived something like it. Before we continue, please subscribe. Let me take you back to where this all started. Growing up in the Martinez household meant living in the shadow of olive green uniforms and polished medals. My father, Colonel James Martinez, served 3 tours in Afghanistan and earned enough commendations to fill an entire wall of our living room. My mother, Captain Elena Martinez, worked as a trauma nurse at Walter Reed Medical Center, saving soldiers' lives while Dad saved missions overseas. Then there was my older brother Miguel, who followed Dad's footsteps straight into the Navy SEALs at 18, becoming the golden child who could do no wrong. And then there was me, Sarah, the disappointment, the one who chose books over bullets, languages over loyalty, and college over combat. While my family wore their service with pride, I spent my teenage years buried in foreign language textbooks, teaching myself Mandarin characters at 2 a.m. and practicing Arabic pronunciation in my bedroom mirror. My parents thought it was just a phase, something I'd grow out of once I realized the real world demanded real skills. The mockery started small. Dad would chuckle when I'd correct foreign pronunciations on the news, calling me his little professor in that condescending tone parents use when they think your interests are cute but useless. When I got into Georgetown University on a full scholarship for linguistics, he barely looked up from his newspaper. Great, another 4 years of playing with words while your brother's out there defending freedom, he muttered. Mom tried to mediate, suggesting that maybe languages could be useful in the military, but Dad shut that down fast. The Army needs soldiers, not translators hiding behind desks. College became my escape from their expectations. While Miguel sent home photos from SEAL training looking like a recruiting poster come to life, I dove deeper into my studies. I wasn't just learning languages anymore, I was mastering them. Professors were amazed at how quickly I picked up not just vocabulary and grammar, but cultural nuances, regional dialects, even the subtle political implications behind certain phrases. By my sophomore year, I was fluent in 6 languages. By senior year, I'd added 3 more to my repertoire. But every family gathering became a battlefield. Dad's military buddies would come over for barbecues and he'd parade Miguel around like a trophy while I tried to blend into the background. "This one's my real pride and joy," he'd say, slapping Miguel on the back. Following the family tradition, unlike some people who think the world needs more college graduates. The implication was always clear. I was the soft one, the weak link, the child who chose comfort over courage. The worst part wasn't even the direct insults. It was the way Dad would dismiss everything I accomplished. When I graduated summa cum laude, he attended the ceremony, but spent the entire time talking to other parents about Miguel's latest deployment. When I got accepted into a prestigious graduate program, he asked when I was going to get a real job. When I mentioned that several government agencies had reached out about my language skills, he laughed and said, "What are you going to do, translate restaurant menus?" What hurt most was knowing that my skills were actually valuable. I'd spent countless hours researching how linguists served in the military, how they were crucial for intelligence operations, diplomatic missions, and cultural understanding in conflict zones. I knew that someone with my language abilities could make a real difference in national security. But every time I tried to explain this to Dad, he'd wave me off with comments about desk jockeys and real soldiers. The breaking point came during my graduation party. Dad had invited his entire unit over, and as usual, the conversation turned to military service. "Sarah here thinks she's going to save the world with her language degrees," he announced to the group, getting laughs from his fellow officers. "Maybe she can teach terrorists proper grammar before they surrender." The humiliation burned through me as grown men laughed at my life's work. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. 6 months after graduation, I was still living at home, supposedly job hunting while secretly planning something that would blow Dad's mind. The family dynamics hadn't improved. If anything, they'd gotten worse. Dad's disappointment in me had crystallized into a routine of daily jabs and passive-aggressive comments. Every morning over coffee, he'd ask if I'd found a real job yet, emphasizing the word real like my 4 years of academic achievement had been an elaborate joke. Miguel was home on leave that summer, which made everything 10 times worse. He'd been promoted again, earning some specialized commendation that had Dad beaming with pride for weeks. The contrast couldn't have been starker. There was Miguel, tanned and muscular from months of training, regaling everyone with carefully edited stories from his deployments, while I sat there in my Georgetown University t-shirt, still figuring out my life at 24. The annual 4th of July barbecue was approaching, and Dad had invited half the base to our backyard. This was his favorite event of the year, a chance to play host to his military community while showing off his perfect soldier son and conveniently forgetting about his disappointment daughter. I'd been dreading it for weeks, knowing it would be another day of enduring condescending questions about my plans, and watching Dad glow with pride every time someone complimented Miguel. The day arrived with typical summer heat and the sound of Dad setting up his elaborate grilling station. By noon, our backyard was filled with uniforms, both active duty and retired, along with their families. The conversations flowed predictably, centered around deployments, promotions, and the state of various military operations around the world. I tried to stay in the background, helping Mom with drinks and avoiding the clusters of Dad's friends who always seemed to have opinions about young people these days. But Dad had other plans. About an hour into the party, he called for everyone's attention, standing near his prized barbecue pit with a beer raised high. "I want to thank everyone for coming out today to celebrate our country's independence," he began, his voice carrying the authority that came from decades of command. "It means everything to have real patriots here, people who understand what service and sacrifice actually mean." His eyes found mine across the crowd, and I felt my stomach drop. Now, some of you have been asking about my kids. Miguel here, as you all know, is continuing the family tradition with the SEALs. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause as Miguel nodded modestly, playing his part perfectly. But I've also got Sarah here, who's taken a different path. She's been studying languages in college for the past 4 years. The way he said studying languages made it sound like I'd been collecting bottle caps or doing crossword puzzles. Several of his friends chuckled, and I felt the familiar burn of humiliation creeping up my neck. 9 languages, actually, I said quietly, but Dad was already continuing. 9 languages, he repeated with exaggerated amazement. Can you believe that? While Miguel's been learning to protect American interests overseas, Sarah's been learning to say hello in 9 different ways. The laughter was louder this time, and I felt my face burning. I keep telling her that knowing how to order coffee in Mandarin isn't exactly a marketable skill, but you know how these college kids are. They think the real world runs on participation trophies. Colonel Henderson, one of Dad's oldest friends, raised his beer. "Well, James, at least you got one right," he said, gesturing toward Miguel. "These days, half these kids think they can serve their country from behind a computer screen." More laughter rippled through the crowd. That's when something inside me snapped. All the years of being dismissed, all the condescending comments, all the comparisons to Miguel came rushing to the surface. But instead of exploding, I felt an eerie calm wash over me because I knew something they didn't. In exactly 48 hours, everything they thought they knew about me was going to change forever. What none of them knew, what I'd kept hidden for 6 months, was that I hadn't been job hunting at all. I'd been preparing for something that would make Dad's 20-year career look like basic training. The decision had come to me during that humiliating graduation party when I realized that proving my worth to Dad meant speaking his language, quite literally. 3 days after that party, I'd walked into a nondescript government building in downtown DC, following up on an email that had arrived in my inbox 2 weeks earlier. The subject line had been simple: Linguistic Services Opportunity, Security Clearance Required. Most people would have deleted it as spam, but something about the official government domain and the formal language structure told me this was legitimate. The meeting was unlike anything I'd expected. Instead of a typical job interview, I found myself in a windowless conference room with 3 people who introduced themselves only by first names. Sarah, the lead interviewer, was probably in her 40s with the kind of sharp intelligence that comes from years in government service. She spoke to me in fluent Arabic for the first 10 minutes, then switched seamlessly to Mandarin, testing not just my vocabulary but my understanding of cultural context and political nuance. Most people who claim to speak 9 languages are exaggerating, she said finally, switching back to English. They know enough to order food or ask for directions, but they can't handle complex technical discussions or cultural subtleties. You're different. She slid a thick packet across the table. This is a preliminary security clearance application. If you're serious about using your skills to serve your country, we'd like to talk. The next 3 hours were a blur of paperwork, background checks, and the most thorough interview of my life. They asked about everything, from my college grades to my family's military service to my motivations for applying. When I mentioned Dad's disappointment in my career choices, Sarah exchanged a meaningful look with her colleagues. Military families often have specific expectations about service, she said carefully, but what we do here is just as important as what happens on traditional battlefields. More important, in some cases, the intelligence you could gather, the cultural bridges you could build, the lives you could save through accurate translation and cultural understanding, that's invaluable. The formal offer came 2 weeks later, along with orders to report for specialized training at a facility I'd never heard of. The training was unlike anything I could have imagined. For 6 months, I learned skills that had nothing to do with the languages I already spoke and everything to do with how to use them under pressure. I learned how to conduct interrogations, how to build rapport with foreign contacts, how to detect lies across cultural barriers, and how to extract crucial intelligence from seemingly casual conversations. My trainers were impressed with my progress. Captain Rodriguez, a former Army Ranger who now worked intelligence operations, told me I had a natural instinct for reading people that couldn't be taught. You don't just speak these languages, he said during one of our evaluation sessions. You think in them. That's the difference between a translator and an intelligence asset. The security clearance process was extensive, involving interviews with everyone from my high school teachers to my college roommates. FBI agents visited Georgetown to verify my academic records and spoke with professors about my character and capabilities. The background investigation was so thorough that I was amazed my family hadn't noticed, but I'd been careful to frame it as graduate school applications whenever anyone asked about the official-looking mail or mysterious phone calls. Living the double life was harder than I'd expected. Every day, I'd leave the house supposedly to job hunt or work on my portfolio, but actually, I was reporting to training facilities or meeting with intelligence officers who were preparing me for assignments I couldn't discuss with anyone. The physical training was brutal, designed to prepare me for deployments in potentially hostile environments. The psychological training was even more challenging, teaching me how to maintain cover identities and handle interrogations if I was ever compromised. The hardest part was watching Dad's continued disappointment while knowing I was about to exceed every expectation he'd ever had for military service. During those months of training, he'd gotten worse about the comments, as if my continued unemployment confirmed every negative thing he'd ever thought about my choices. Maybe it's time to consider community college, he suggested one evening. Learn a practical skill like automotive repair or dental hygiene. But I also knew this was exactly what I'd needed. Dad respected one thing above all else: military service. Not just any service, but the kind of elite, specialized, dangerous work that separated the true warriors from the weekend soldiers. What I was preparing for would put me in more danger and require more specialized skills than anything Miguel had ever done, even in the SEALs. The mission briefing came on a Tuesday morning in July, exactly 1 week before the barbecue that would change everything. I was being deployed to a classified location where my language skills would be crucial for an ongoing intelligence operation. The details were need to know, but I understood enough to realize this was the kind of assignment that could save American lives and potentially prevent an international incident. As I sat in that final briefing, listening to my commanding officer explain the stakes and the timeline, I realized that everything Dad had mocked me for had been preparing me for this moment. Every late night memorizing vocabulary, every hour practicing pronunciation, every cultural nuance I'd absorbed had been leading to an opportunity to serve my country in a way that was uniquely mine. The deployment orders were clear. I had 2 weeks to complete final preparations and say goodbye to my family. What they didn't say, but what I knew, was that this goodbye might reveal everything I'd been hiding. The question wasn't whether Dad would finally be proud of me. The question was whether he'd be able to handle the truth about what his disappointment daughter was really capable of. The manila envelope arrived at my secure P.O. box on a Wednesday morning, marked with the kind of official seals that make your heart race before you even open them. Inside were my deployment orders, printed on letterhead that carried more authority than anything Dad had ever received in his 20 years of service. The header read, Special Operations Command, Intelligence Division, and seeing those words made everything real in a way that months of training hadn't quite achieved. My reporting date was exactly 10 days away. 10 days to finalize my affairs, complete my last-minute preparations, and somehow navigate what would likely be my final family interactions before disappearing into a classified assignment that I couldn't discuss for security reasons. The mission details were sparse in the written orders, but I understood from my briefings that I'd be working with a joint task force dealing with a developing situation in Eastern Europe where my Russian and Ukrainian language skills would be critical. What struck me most about the orders wasn't the destination or even the classified nature of the mission. It was the language used to describe my role. Terms like essential personnel, specialized linguistic asset, and critical intelligence gathering filled the document. After years of Dad dismissing my abilities as glorified party tricks, seeing them described in military terms as mission-critical skills felt like vindication in its purest form. The practical preparations were more complex than I'd anticipated. My handler, Agent Stevens, walked me through everything during a meeting at a coffee shop near Georgetown. To maintain operational security, my family would be told I was taking a consulting position overseas that required extensive travel. The cover story was solid but vague enough to deflect detailed questions. More importantly, my emergency contacts and next-of-kin information would be updated in military systems, which meant that if anything happened to me, my family would be notified through official military channels. Your father's military record came up during our background check, Stevens mentioned casually while reviewing my documentation. Colonel Martinez has quite an impressive service record, 3 Bronze Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, commendations for leadership under fire. That's the kind of career that commands respect throughout the military community. He paused, looking up from the files. I imagine he has strong opinions about military service. The understatement of the century, I thought. You could say that, I replied, not trusting myself to elaborate without revealing too much about our relationship dynamics. Stevens nodded knowingly, as if he'd encountered similar family situations before. Sometimes the hardest part of this job isn't the operational challenges, he said. It's the personal relationships we have to navigate, the people we can't tell, the conversations we can't have, the recognition we can't receive. Your family may never fully understand what you're contributing to national security, and that's a sacrifice in itself. His words hit harder than I'd expected. All this time, I'd been focused on proving Dad wrong, on showing him that my skills had value and my choices had meaning. But Stevens was right about the deeper cost. Even after this deployment, even if I distinguished myself in ways that would make any military parent proud, I might never be able to share those achievements with the people whose approval I'd spent my life seeking. The security briefing that followed was extensive. I learned about communication protocols, emergency procedures, and the various ways my mission could be compromised. The most sobering part was the discussion of worst-case scenarios. If I was captured or killed while operating under deep cover, the military would handle notifications and arrangements, but the details of my service might remain classified indefinitely. My family would know I died serving my country, but they might never know exactly how or why. As I walked home from that meeting, my deployment orders secure in my bag, I felt the weight of what I was about to undertake. This wasn't just about proving Dad wrong anymore. This was about stepping into a world where the stakes were life and death, where my language skills could mean the difference between successful intelligence gathering and international incidents, where my mistakes could cost lives and my successes might never be publicly acknowledged. The timing of my departure meant I'd be leaving right after the 4th of July barbecue, which now took on an entirely different significance. Instead of dreading another day of humiliation and dismissive comments, I realized this would be my last chance to see my family before disappearing into a classified world they couldn't access. The irony wasn't lost on me that Dad's celebration of military service would be my send-off to a level of military service he'd never imagined I was capable of achieving. That evening, I sat in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by the language textbooks and cultural study guides that had shaped my path to this moment. In a few days, those same books would be packed away while I put their lessons to use in ways I'd never anticipated. The scared college graduate who'd endured Dad's mockery at graduation was about to become a classified intelligence asset whose skills were deemed essential to American national security. The transformation felt surreal, but also inevitable. Every disparaging comment Dad had made about my useless languages, every comparison to Miguel's more traditional military service, every suggestion that I was wasting my potential had been preparing me for this moment of ultimate vindication. Soon, very soon, everything would change. While I was making my final preparations, something was happening in military intelligence circles that I knew nothing about. My commanding officer, General Patricia Martinez, had a policy of thoroughly researching the backgrounds of personnel being deployed on high-stakes missions. It wasn't just about security clearances and operational readiness. She believed that understanding her people's personal circumstances made her a better commander and helped her anticipate potential complications during deployment. General Martinez was a legend in intelligence circles, a woman who'd broken through barriers in a male-dominated field through a combination of brilliant strategic thinking and an uncanny ability to read people and situations. She'd earned her stars by consistently delivering results in the most challenging operational environments, and her success rate was largely attributed to her meticulous attention to detail, especially when it came to the human elements of intelligence work. When my file crossed her desk, she was immediately impressed by my linguistic capabilities and the speed with which I'd completed specialized training. But what caught her attention even more was my family background. It wasn't unusual for military intelligence personnel to come from military families, but the specifics of my situation were noteworthy. My father's service record was exceptional, my brother's SEAL career was distinguished, and yet I'd chosen a completely different path before eventually finding my way to intelligence work. General Martinez had seen this pattern before. Some of the best intelligence officers came from military families where they'd initially felt like outsiders, where their different skills and interests had been undervalued or misunderstood. These individuals often brought a unique combination of motivation and capability to their work, driven by a deep desire to prove themselves while possessing the cultural understanding of military life that made them effective in joint operations. She decided to dig deeper into my background, not because she doubted my qualifications, but because she wanted to understand what had driven me to this career path. The detailed background investigation revealed the family dynamics I'd tried so hard to hide. Interviews with neighbors, family friends, and even some of Dad's military colleagues painted a picture of a brilliant young woman who'd been consistently dismissed by a father who couldn't see past traditional notions of military service. What particularly struck General Martinez was a comment from one of Dad's fellow officers during a routine background interview. Colonel Henderson had mentioned, almost as an aside, how Jim Martinez was always complaining about his daughter's useless college degree and her waste of time with foreign languages. The colonel had actually disagreed with Dad's assessment, noting that linguistic skills were increasingly valuable in modern military operations, but he'd kept his opinions to himself out of professional courtesy. General Martinez found herself thinking about this information as she reviewed my training reports and psychological evaluations. Everything indicated that I was exceptionally well suited for intelligence work, with natural instincts for cultural analysis and interpersonal dynamics that couldn't be taught. My trainers consistently noted my ability to think strategically while maintaining the detail-oriented focus necessary for complex linguistic analysis. But there was also something else in the reports, a driven quality that suggested I was working not just for professional success, but for personal vindication. The more she learned about my family situation, the more impressed she became with my resilience and determination. Choosing to pursue linguistic studies in a family that valued traditional military service had required courage. Maintaining academic excellence while dealing with constant dismissal from a parent had required strength. And ultimately, finding a way to serve my country using exactly the skills that had been ridiculed demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that made for exceptional intelligence officers. But General Martinez was also a pragmatist. She understood that family dynamics could become operational complications, especially in high-stress environments. If I was deployed carrying unresolved issues with my father, those emotional burdens could affect my performance or decision-making under pressure. More importantly, if something happened to me during the mission, the family notifications would be handled through official military channels, which meant my father would be contacted by senior officers who would necessarily describe my role and its importance. The idea began forming in her mind during a routine briefing about operational security and family relations. What if the family notification process could be handled proactively rather than reactively? What if, instead of waiting for a potential tragedy to reveal my true role, the family could be informed in advance of my deployment and its significance? It would serve multiple purposes, ensuring that my personal life was settled before deployment, demonstrating military respect for my family's service record, and potentially providing me with the family support that could enhance my operational effectiveness. General Martinez was well aware of Colonel James Martinez's service record and reputation. They'd never met personally, but she knew officers who'd served with him and spoke highly of his leadership and dedication. He was exactly the kind of military professional who would understand the importance of specialized intelligence work once it was properly explained to him. The problem wasn't his capacity to appreciate my contributions. It was his lack of information about what those contributions actually were. The decision crystallized for her during a conversation with her aide about family notification protocols. Why not make this a positive notification rather than waiting for a potentially tragic one? Why not use this as an opportunity to demonstrate how the military valued all forms of service, including the kind of specialized intelligence work that families might not fully understand? It would be unprecedented, but General Martinez had built her career on finding innovative solutions to complex problems. She instructed her aide to arrange a personal phone call to Colonel Martinez for the Friday evening before my deployment. The timing would be perfect. Close enough to deployment to emphasize the urgency and importance of my mission, but early enough to allow for family conversations and emotional preparation. She would handle the call personally, both as a matter of professional courtesy to a fellow senior officer, and because she wanted to ensure the message was delivered with appropriate gravity and respect. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. One phone call would accomplish multiple objectives: honoring my family's military service, ensuring my personal affairs were settled before deployment, and providing my father with the recognition and respect he deserved for raising a daughter who was about to serve her country in an exceptional capacity. General Martinez had no way of knowing that this call would arrive in the middle of Dad's annual barbecue, or that the timing would create the perfect moment for maximum impact. Friday evening arrived with the oppressive heat that makes July in Virginia feel like living inside a sauna. Dad had been preparing for his barbecue since dawn, arranging tables in the backyard, setting up his elaborate sound system, and obsessing over the precise arrangement of lawn chairs that would accommodate his growing guest list. This year's 4th of July celebration was shaping up to be his biggest yet, with over 30 military personnel and their families expected to attend. I spent the day in a strange state of emotional suspension, knowing this would be the last family gathering before my deployment, but unable to share that information with anyone. My official cover story was that I had a job interview on Monday with an international consulting firm, which explained why I seemed distracted and why I'd been receiving more official-looking mail lately. The lie sat uncomfortably with me, but operational security demanded it. Miguel had arrived that morning with his latest girlfriend, a nurse from San Diego, who seemed appropriately impressed by our family's military credentials. She spent the day asking Dad questions about his service record and listening with wide-eyed attention to his stories about combat leadership and strategic decision-making. Her enthusiasm fed Dad's ego in ways that made him more expansive and confident than usual, which unfortunately meant his comments about my career choices became more pointed and public. "Sarah's still figuring out her path," he explained to Major Peterson's wife during the afternoon setup. "Some kids take longer to find their direction, you know? We keep hoping she'll discover something more practical than all those foreign languages, but she's stubborn like her mother." The casual dismissal stung, but I found myself storing it away as fuel for what was coming. As evening approached and guests began arriving, the familiar dynamic reasserted itself. Dad held court near his grilling station, regaling anyone who would listen with stories from his deployments while making sure everyone knew about Miguel's achievements with the SEALs. I helped Mom with food service and tried to stay in the background, but several of Dad's colleagues made polite conversation about my post-graduation plans, clearly having been briefed that I was the academic child who'd chosen college over military service. The conversations followed predictable patterns. People would ask about my degree, nod politely when I mentioned linguistics, and then change the subject to something more traditionally military-oriented. A few of the more progressive officers made comments about how languages could be useful in modern warfare, but these observations were generally met with dismissive responses from Dad about how real military work required real skills, not classroom knowledge. By 7 o'clock, the party was in full swing. Dad had moved beyond his usual conversational mockery into full performance mode, encouraged by an audience of colleagues who appreciated his humor and his beer. The combination of alcohol, ego, and professional camaraderie created the perfect storm for his most dismissive comments yet about my career choices and life direction. "You know what Sarah told me last week?" he announced to a group of senior NCOs who'd gathered around the grill. "She said her language skills could be valuable for national security. Can you imagine? Like terrorists are going to surrender because she can conjugate verbs in Arabic." The laughter was loud and prolonged, with several people adding their own comments about college graduates who thought textbook knowledge could replace real-world experience. Colonel Henderson raised his beer in a mock toast. "Here's to all the kids who think they can serve their country from behind a desk," he declared. "Meanwhile, the real work gets done by people like Miguel here, who understand what sacrifice actually means." The toast was enthusiastically received, with multiple voices agreeing that traditional military service was the only service that truly mattered. I felt my face burning with humiliation, but something else was building inside me. This wasn't just hurt anymore, it was anticipation. In less than an hour, if General Martinez kept to her scheduled timeline, everything these people thought they knew about military service and national security was about to be turned upside down. The irony was almost perfect. Dad's moment of maximum dismissive confidence was about to become his moment of maximum shock and realization. Miguel, to his credit, seemed uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Languages are actually pretty important in special operations," he said quietly, but his comment was drowned out by more laughter and additional jokes about the difference between real soldiers and college kids playing dress-up. As 8 o'clock approached, I found myself checking my phone more frequently, not because I expected to be notified about the call, but because the anticipation was becoming almost unbearable. Everything I'd worked for, Everything I'd endured, all the training and preparation and secrecy was about to culminate in a single phone conversation that would change my family's understanding of who I was and what I was capable of achieving. Dad was in peak form, surrounded by friends and colleagues, basking in the admiration and respect that came from his distinguished military career and his perfect soldier son. He had no idea that in a matter of minutes, his phone would ring with news that would force him to reconsider every assumption he'd ever made about service, sacrifice, and the different ways someone could contribute to their country's security. The setup was perfect, the audience was ideal, and the timing couldn't have been better. Dad's moment of ultimate confidence was about to become his moment of ultimate education, delivered by a 3-star general who would explain exactly how valuable his disappointment daughter had become to American national security. At exactly 8:47 p.m., while Dad was in the middle of explaining to Captain Morrison why real military leadership can't be learned from books, his phone rang. The ringtone was loud enough to cut through the conversations and music, causing a brief lull in the party atmosphere. Dad glanced at the display, saw an unfamiliar number with a DC area code, and almost declined the call before noticing it was coming from a government exchange that he recognized from his own military service. "Excuse me for a second," he said to his audience, stepping slightly away from the group but remaining well within earshot of everyone gathered around the grill. He answered with his typical professional tone. "Colonel Martinez speaking." The voice on the other end was crisp, authoritative, and unmistakably female. "Colonel Martinez, this is General Patricia Martinez with Special Operations Command Intelligence Division. Do you have a few minutes to speak privately?" The name coincidence wasn't lost on Dad, but the title and command designation immediately commanded his full attention. A 3-star general didn't make casual social calls to retired colonels, especially not on Friday evenings. "Of course, General," Dad replied, his voice taking on the formal cadence that decades of military service had ingrained in him. The nearby conversations quieted as people recognized the change in his demeanor. In military social circles, when someone receives a call from a general officer, everyone pays attention out of both curiosity and respect for the hierarchy. General Martinez's tone was professionally warm but carried an undertone of serious business. "Colonel, I'm calling regarding your daughter, Sarah Martinez. She's currently assigned to my command for a classified intelligence operation, and I wanted to personally inform you about her upcoming deployment." The words hit Dad like a physical blow. His face went through a series of rapid changes, from confusion to disbelief to something approaching shock. "I'm sorry, General, but I think there might be some mistake," Dad said, his voice betraying his confusion. "My daughter Sarah isn't in the military. She's a civilian with a linguistics degree who's been job hunting since graduation." The statement hung in the air like a challenge, and I could see several of his friends exchanging glances, unsure whether this was some kind of elaborate joke or genuine confusion. General Martinez's response was patient but firm. "Colonel, there's no mistake. Sarah enlisted 6 months ago through our specialized recruitment program for linguists with advanced language capabilities. She's completed intensive training at classified facilities and has been selected for a critical intelligence mission that requires her specific skill set. Her linguistic abilities in 9 languages, combined with her cultural analysis training and security clearance, make her invaluable for this operation." The silence that followed was absolute. Dad stood frozen, phone pressed to his ear, while 30 military personnel and their families watched his expression cycle through disbelief, confusion, and dawning realization. Miguel had stopped mid-conversation and was staring at me with wide eyes, clearly trying to process what he was hearing. Mom had emerged from the kitchen, drawn by the sudden quiet, and was looking between Dad and me with growing concern. 9 languages? Dad repeated weakly, as if hearing the number for the first time, though I'd mentioned it countless times over the years. "You said intelligence mission?" His voice cracked slightly on the word intelligence, and I realized that for the first time in my adult life, my father was genuinely speechless. General Martinez continued with military precision. "Colonel, your daughter has demonstrated exceptional aptitude for intelligence gathering and cultural analysis. The operation she's being deployed for is classified at the highest levels, but I can tell you that her contributions will be critical to American national security interests in Eastern Europe. Her ability to conduct complex linguistic analysis and cultural interpretation in multiple languages simultaneously is exactly what this mission requires. Dad's knees seemed to buckle slightly, and he reached out to steady himself against a nearby table. The beer in his other hand went forgotten, tilting dangerously as his grip loosened. "How long has she been?" he started, then stopped, seeming unable to complete the question. His eyes found mine across the yard, and for the first time in years, I saw something other than disappointment in his expression. It looked almost like fear. 6 months of intensive training, Colonel, the general answered the question he couldn't finish. She's been preparing for this deployment while maintaining operational security, which means she couldn't discuss her military service with family members until now. That level of discretion and professionalism, combined with her technical capabilities, is why she was selected for this particular assignment. The backyard had become a tableau of frozen figures. Career military personnel who had spent the evening dismissing my academic achievements were now witnessing their colleague receive a personal call from a 3-star general explaining why his disappointment daughter was being deployed on a classified intelligence mission. The cognitive dissonance was visible on their faces as they tried to reconcile what they were hearing with their previous assumptions. Colonel Henderson, who had led the toasts mocking college graduates, looked like he was witnessing something impossible. Major Peterson had set down his beer and was listening with the intense focus of someone trying to understand a tactical briefing. Even Miguel looked stunned, his usual confidence replaced by something approaching awe as he realized his little sister had been operating in a world he'd never even considered. Dad finally managed to speak again, his voice barely above a whisper. "General, are you telling me that Sarah has been in military intelligence for 6 months and I didn't know?" The question carried layers of meaning, from professional embarrassment to personal shame to genuine confusion about how such a thing was possible. "That's correct, Colonel," General Martinez replied. "Operational security required maintaining her cover until deployment. But given your distinguished military record and your family's history of service, I felt it was appropriate to personally inform you of her upcoming mission and its importance to American national security. Your daughter is about to serve her country in a capacity that few people are qualified to handle." The weight of those words settled over the gathering like a heavy blanket. Everything Dad had said about my useless degree, my lack of practical skills, my failure to contribute meaningfully to society was being systematically dismantled by a superior officer who clearly understood the value of exactly the capabilities he'd spent years mocking. General Martinez continued speaking, her voice carrying the authority that comes from years of operational command and strategic decision-making. "Colonel Martinez, I want you to understand the significance of what your daughter has achieved. The specialized linguistic intelligence unit she's joining has a success rate that exceeds every other intelligence gathering operation in our current portfolio. The cultural analysis and real-time translation capabilities she brings to this mission could quite literally save American lives." Dad's face had gone pale, and I could see him struggling to process information that contradicted everything he thought he knew about my life and capabilities. "General, when you say lives could be saved," he began, his voice trailing off as if he couldn't quite form the question he needed to ask. "I can't discuss operational details over an unsecured line," General Martinez replied. "But I can tell you that intelligence failures in this region have previously resulted in American casualties. Having someone with Sarah's linguistic capabilities and cultural understanding embedded with our operational teams significantly reduces the risk of miscommunication or cultural misinterpretation that could lead to tragic outcomes." The military personnel gathered in our backyard were listening with the focused attention of professionals who understood exactly what General Martinez was describing. Colonel Henderson, who had spent the evening joking about college graduates hiding behind desks, now looked like he was receiving a tactical briefing about life-and-death operational realities. The dismissive comments about real soldiers versus desk jockeys seemed to evaporate as the assembled officers began understanding the critical nature of intelligence work. Miguel stepped closer to Dad, his expression showing genuine amazement. "Sarah's been training for 6 months?" he asked quietly, but loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "What kind of training?" His question carried the respect of someone who understood that military training, regardless of the specialty, required dedication and capability that he'd never credited me with possessing. General Martinez seemed to hear the question through the phone. "Colonel, your son might be interested to know that Sarah's training included survival techniques, resistance to interrogation, advanced cultural psychology, and real-time intelligence analysis under extreme pressure. The psychological and physical demands of intelligence work are different from traditional combat training, but they're no less rigorous or dangerous." Dad's hand holding the phone began to shake almost imperceptibly. "Dangerous?" he repeated, his voice carrying a note of concern that I'd never heard directed toward me before. For years he'd worried about Miguel's safety during SEAL deployments, but the idea that his academic daughter might face genuine danger in service of her country seemed to be hitting him in ways he hadn't expected. "Any intelligence operation carries inherent risks," General Martinez explained. "Sarah will be operating in environments where discovery could result in international incidents or personal harm. Her ability to maintain cover while gathering critical information requires not just linguistic skills, but courage and strategic thinking under pressure. The psychological profiles and aptitude tests she's completed indicate she possesses exactly the combination of intellectual capability and emotional resilience that this work demands." The words courage and strategic thinking seemed to hit Dad with particular force. These were qualities he'd always associated with traditional military leadership, characteristics he'd consistently attributed to Miguel, while implying I lacked them entirely. Hearing a 3-star general describe me in these terms was clearly forcing him to reconsider fundamental assumptions about my character and capabilities. Captain Morrison, who had been listening intently, stepped forward with the respectful posture military personnel adopt when senior officers are speaking. "Colonel Martinez," he said quietly to my father, "if General Martinez is personally calling to brief you on a deployment, this isn't routine intelligence work. This is the kind of assignment that gets people promoted and commended at the highest levels." General Martinez's voice carried through the phone clearly enough for nearby listeners to hear her response. "Captain Morrison makes an excellent point. Sarah's assignment is classified at levels that require personal approval from the Secretary of Defense. The intelligence she'll be gathering will be briefed directly to senior policymakers who make decisions about American national security strategy. Her work won't just be valuable, it will be essential." Dad looked around the gathering of military personnel, all of whom were now staring at him with expressions that ranged from amazement to professional curiosity. These were people who understood military hierarchy and the significance of personal attention from general officers. They knew that 3-star generals don't make courtesy calls about routine assignments, and they certainly don't personally brief family members unless the mission involved exceptional circumstances. "General," Dad said slowly, "are you telling me that Sarah's deployment is critical enough to warrant personal notification from Special Operations Command?" His voice carried the tone of someone who was beginning to understand that this conversation was about more than just informing him of my military service. It was about recognizing a level of contribution to national security that exceeded anything he'd achieved in his own distinguished career. "That's exactly what I'm telling you, Colonel," General Martinez replied. "Your daughter's unique capabilities make her irreplaceable for this mission. We've been searching for someone with her specific combination of linguistic skills, cultural understanding, and analytical capabilities for over 2 years. When she came to our attention, it was clear that she represented exactly the kind of specialized asset that modern intelligence operations require." The word irreplaceable hung in the air like a revelation. Dad had spent years suggesting that my skills were worthless, that my education was impractical, that my contributions to society would be minimal. Now he was hearing from one of the military's most senior officers that I possessed capabilities that had taken the intelligence community 2 years to find, and that my specific skills were essential to American national security. I watched as the full weight of this information settled over him. Every dismissive comment, every comparison to Miguel, every suggestion that I was wasting my potential was being systematically contradicted by someone whose authority and expertise he couldn't question. The realization that his disappointment daughter was about to serve her country in ways that exceeded his own contributions was clearly overwhelming him in ways I'd never seen before. The transformation in Dad's expression was like watching someone's entire worldview collapse and rebuild itself in real time. His face cycled through confusion, disbelief, recognition, and finally something that looked like genuine fear. Not for his safety, but for his understanding of reality itself. The phone in his hand seemed to grow heavier as General Martinez continued speaking, each word driving home the magnitude of what he'd missed about his own daughter. "Colonel Martinez," General Martinez continued, "I want you to understand something that goes beyond the operational details. In my 30 years of military service, I've encountered perhaps a dozen individuals with the natural intelligence gathering instincts that Sarah possesses. The ability to read cultural nuances, detect deception across language barriers, and synthesize complex information under pressure. These aren't skills that can be taught. They're intuitive capabilities that some people are born with and others develop through exceptional dedication to understanding human nature." Dad's breathing had become noticeably shallow, and I could see him struggling to reconcile this description with the daughter he thought he knew. "General, when you say natural instincts," he began, then stopped, seeming unable to complete the thought. His eyes found mine across the yard again, but this time the look was different. Instead of the dismissive glance of a parent tolerating a disappointing child, he was looking at me like he was seeing a stranger. "What I mean, Colonel, is that your daughter has demonstrated abilities that our most experienced intelligence officers have difficulty mastering after years of fieldwork. Her trainers consistently reported that she could identify inconsistencies in statements, detect emotional stress in speakers, and analyze cultural context with accuracy rates that exceeded their expectations. These capabilities, combined with her linguistic skills, make her exceptionally valuable for sensitive operations." Miguel had moved closer to me during the conversation, his expression showing something I'd never seen before. Genuine respect mixed with amazement. "Sarah," he whispered, quiet enough that Dad couldn't hear. "You've been training for intelligence work for 6 months? Why didn't you tell me?" His question carried no accusation, only curiosity, and what sounded like admiration for my ability to maintain operational security. Mom had joined our small group, her face showing the complex emotions of a mother learning that her child had been preparing for dangerous work without her knowledge. But there was also something else in her expression: pride. She'd always believed my language skills were valuable, even when Dad dismissed them, and hearing a general officer validate those beliefs was clearly meaningful to her. General Martinez's voice continued through the phone speaker, now loud enough for most of the gathering to hear clearly. "Colonel, I also want you to know that Sarah's decision to pursue this career path required considerable courage. Choosing to serve in intelligence work means accepting that your contributions may never be publicly recognized, that your family may never fully understand what you've accomplished, and that the work itself carries risks that most people would find unacceptable." The word courage seemed to hit Dad with particular impact. He'd spent years implying that I lacked the bravery necessary for meaningful military service, that my choice of academic pursuits over combat roles indicated some fundamental weakness of character. Hearing it described as courageous to choose intelligence work, especially work that required accepting obscurity and danger without recognition, was clearly forcing him to reconsider his understanding of what courage actually meant. Colonel Henderson approached Dad with the respectful manner of a subordinate addressing a superior, even though they were both retired. "Jim," he said quietly, "if your daughter is being personally briefed by General Martinez from Special Operations Command, she's operating at levels that most of us never reached in our entire careers. This isn't just military service. This is elite military service." The comment from his old friend and colleague seemed to penetrate Dad's shock in ways that General Martinez's words hadn't quite achieved. Henderson was someone whose military judgment Dad respected completely, and hearing him describe my assignment as elite military service forced Dad to confront the possibility that his disappointment daughter had actually exceeded his own military achievements. "General," Dad managed to say, his voice barely steady, "you're telling me that Sarah has been selected for assignment that require personal approval from the Secretary of Defense and that her work will be briefed to senior policymakers?" Each word seemed to cost him effort, as if speaking the question made the reality more undeniable. "That's correct, Colonel. Sarah's intelligence reports will be included in briefings that inform decisions about American foreign policy and national security strategy. Her analysis and cultural insights will directly influence how senior leaders understand developing situations in regions where American interests are at stake. The responsibility she's accepting is enormous, and the trust being placed in her judgment reflects the confidence that senior commanders have in her capabilities." Dad looked around the gathering of military personnel, all of whom were now staring at me with expressions that had completely transformed from the dismissive amusement of earlier in the evening. These were career military professionals who understood exactly what General Martinez was describing, and their faces showed the respect and amazement appropriate for learning that someone in their midst was about to undertake the kind of assignment that defined elite military careers. Major Peterson stepped forward with obvious admiration. "Sarah," he said, addressing me directly for the first time all evening, "if you're deploying on classified intelligence operations at this level, you're serving your country in ways that most of us can only imagine. That's extraordinary." His words carried the weight of professional recognition from someone who understood military hierarchy and the significance of personal attention from three-star generals. The moment felt surreal. Hours earlier, these same people had been laughing at Dad's jokes about my useless language degrees and impractical academic pursuits. Now they were looking at me with the respect reserved for elite military personnel undertaking critical national security missions. The reversal was complete, but the person who seemed most affected by it was Dad himself. He was still holding the phone, still listening to General Martinez, but his entire posture had changed. The confident, dismissive father who'd spent the evening entertaining guests with stories about his disappointing daughter had been replaced by someone who looked genuinely shaken by the realization that everything he thought he knew about his own child had been fundamentally wrong. The silence that followed Dad's emotional breakdown stretched for what felt like an eternity. 30 military personnel and their families stood frozen in our backyard, witnessing something none of them had expected. A decorated colonel being humbled by the realization that he'd completely misjudged his own daughter's worth and potential. The barbecue that had started as Dad's celebration of traditional military service had become my vindication in the most public way possible. Miguel was the first to break the silence, stepping forward with an expression I'd never seen on his face before. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying genuine amazement. 6 months of classified training, intelligence operations at the highest levels? Why didn't you tell me?" But even as he asked the question, I could see understanding dawning in his eyes. He knew enough about operational security to realize that I couldn't have shared this information with anyone, not even family. "Operational security," I replied simply, using the military terminology that everyone present would understand. I couldn't discuss my assignment until deployment authorization was confirmed. The words carried weight in this crowd of military professionals who immediately recognized the discipline and professionalism required to maintain such secrecy while living under constant family pressure and mockery. Mom approached me with tears in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. She pulled me into a hug that felt different from any embrace we'd shared before, filled with a pride and respect that had been missing from our relationship for years. "I always knew your languages were special," she whispered in my ear, quiet enough that only I could hear. "I just never imagined they'd take you this far." Colonel Henderson, who had led the toasts mocking college graduates just hours earlier, approached Dad with visible discomfort. "Jim," he said quietly, "I owe your daughter an apology. We all do." What we said tonight about college kids and desk jobs, that was completely out of line. If she's deploying on classified intelligence operations, she's serving at levels that most of us never reached in our entire careers. The apology seemed to trigger something in the other guests. One by one, Dad's military friends began approaching me with expressions of respect and genuine admiration. Major Peterson, who had questioned the value of academic knowledge in military service, extended his hand for a formal handshake. Sarah, if you're working with Special Operations Command at this level, you're representing the very best of what military service can be. I'm honored to meet you. Captain Morrison, who had been part of the earlier conversations dismissing the value of linguistic skills, looked genuinely embarrassed as he spoke. I want you to know that what we said tonight about languages and cultural knowledge, we were completely wrong. In my experience overseas, the missions that succeeded were the ones with proper intelligence and cultural understanding. The missions that failed were the ones where we didn't have that knowledge. Dad stood in the center of this transformation, watching his colleagues and friends recognize the daughter he'd spent years dismissing. The man who had been confident and commanding just an hour earlier now looked smaller, diminished by the realization that his own prejudices and narrow understanding of military service had blinded him to his daughter's exceptional capabilities and dedication. But there was something else happening beyond the apologies and recognition from his friends. I could see Dad processing not just the immediate revelation about my military service, but the deeper implications of what this meant about our relationship, about his role as a father, and about the years of damage that his constant dismissal had caused. The pride he was beginning to feel was being tempered by the growing awareness of how much he'd hurt me and how badly he'd misunderstood who I was as a person. Miguel placed his hand on my shoulder with genuine brotherhood. Sarah, I need you to know something. What you've accomplished, the training you've completed, the mission you're about to undertake, this isn't just impressive, this is extraordinary. I've worked with intelligence officers in special operations, and the ones who make the real difference are exactly the kind of person you've become. The validation from Miguel meant more to me than I'd expected. For years, he'd been the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in Dad's eyes, while I'd been the disappointment who couldn't measure up to his achievements. Hearing him acknowledge not just my accomplishments, but their significance in terms he understood from his own military experience, felt like a fundamental shift in our family dynamic. Mom had been quietly observing the interactions around us, and I could see her processing her own emotions about the situation. She approached Dad with a mixture of support and gentle reproach. "Jim," she said softly, "do you understand what this means? Sarah has been preparing for the most important assignment of her life, while you were making her feel like her choices didn't matter. She's about to serve her country in ways that could save American lives, and she did it all while you were telling her she was wasting her potential." Dad's response was barely audible. "I know," he said, his voice broken with the weight of realization. "I know, and I don't know how to fix what I've done to her, to us." The admission was painful to witness, but it was also the first completely honest thing he'd said about our relationship in years. The confident colonel who had always known exactly what to say and how to command respect was now faced with a situation where his authority and experience were meaningless, and his failures as a father were being exposed in front of everyone he respected. The party began to wind down naturally as guests recognized that the evening had shifted from celebration to something much more personal and complex. Dad's military colleagues made their polite farewells, each taking time to speak with me privately before leaving, offering words of respect and admiration that felt surreal after years of being dismissed as the family disappointment. By 10 o'clock, only our immediate family remained in the backyard, surrounded by the debris of Dad's annual barbecue and the emotional wreckage of revelations that had changed everything. Dad spent nearly an hour cleaning up with unusual intensity, clearly using the physical activity to process what had happened and figure out how to approach a conversation that he'd never had to have before. I watched him methodically folding chairs and packing away decorations, his movements mechanical and thoughtful in ways that suggested he was rehearsing words he'd never expected to need. When the last table was stored and the grill was cleaned, he finally approached me with the careful manner of someone who knew they were walking into emotional territory they'd never navigated. "Sarah, he began, then stopped, seeming to realize that everything he'd planned to say was inadequate for the situation we were facing. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to apologize for something this big, this fundamental. His voice carried a vulnerability I'd never heard before, the uncertainty of someone who had always been confident in his judgments, suddenly confronted with evidence of how wrong those judgments had been. For 20 years, he continued, I thought I understood what military service meant. I thought I understood what courage looked like, what sacrifice required, what serving your country actually involved. I measured everything against my own experience, my own understanding, and I used that narrow definition to judge you unfairly. The admission was clearly difficult for him to make, requiring him to acknowledge not just that he'd been wrong about me, but that his entire framework for understanding military value had been limited and prejudiced. Miguel had positioned himself nearby, clearly wanting to be part of this conversation, but uncertain about his role in a dynamic that had excluded him for years. Mom sat quietly on the porch, close enough to hear but far enough away to give us space for what needed to be said. The setting felt appropriate somehow, the backyard where I'd endured years of public humiliation now serving as the location for Dad's attempt at private reconciliation. What I learned tonight, Dad said, his voice gaining strength as he found his footing in this unfamiliar emotional territory, is that you found a way to serve that requires everything I dismissed about you. Your languages, your cultural understanding, your analytical thinking, all the things I called impractical or useless, they're exactly what makes you valuable for the most important kind of military work. You didn't fail to live up to military standards, you exceeded them in ways I was too narrow-minded to recognize. The words were everything I'd wanted to hear for years. But they were coming at a time when their impact was complicated by the knowledge that I was leaving in 48 hours for an assignment that might fundamentally change our relationship regardless of what was said tonight. The validation felt both tremendously meaningful and somehow insufficient to address the years of damage that had been done to our connection as father and daughter. Dad, I said carefully, I appreciate what you're trying to say. And I understand that learning about my military service has changed how you see my choices. But you need to understand that your approval or disapproval doesn't define my worth anymore. I've spent the last 6 months proving to myself and to the military that my capabilities have value, regardless of whether you recognize them. The statement clearly hit him hard, forcing him to confront the reality that his opinion, which had once been the most important validation I sought, was no longer the central factor in my sense of self-worth. Years of dismissal and mockery had taught me to find validation elsewhere, and the military had provided that validation in ways that were both professionally meaningful and personally healing. I know I can't undo the years of making you feel like your choices didn't matter, Dad said, tears now visible in his eyes. I know I can't take back the times I compared you unfavorably to Miguel, or the jokes I made about your education, or the way I dismissed your potential. But I need you to know that I was wrong, completely wrong, and that my failure to see your worth says nothing about who you are and everything about my limitations as a father. The apology was more comprehensive and emotionally honest than anything I'd expected from him, but it was also coming at a time when its practical impact was limited by the reality of my impending deployment. In less than 2 days, I would be leaving for an assignment that could last months and would necessarily involve limited communication with family members. The timing meant that this conversation, as important as it was, would have to serve as both reconciliation and farewell. Miguel stepped forward with obvious emotional discomfort. Sarah, I need to say something too. I've been part of this family dynamic where Dad's approval meant everything, and I never stood up for you when he was being unfair. I benefited from being the good military child while you were being dismissed as the disappointment, and that wasn't right. What you've accomplished, the path you've chosen, it's not just impressive. It's braver than anything I've done because you did it without family support and recognition. The acknowledgement from Miguel was unexpected and deeply meaningful. For years, our relationship had been defined by the comparison Dad constantly made between his successful military son and his disappointing academic daughter. Hearing Miguel recognize that my path had actually required more courage because I'd had to pursue it without family encouragement felt like a fundamental shift in how our family understood success and service. But even as these long overdue conversations were happening, I could feel the weight of my impending departure creating urgency around everything that needed to be said and resolved. This wasn't just about processing past hurts and misunderstandings. It was about figuring out how to move forward as a family when everything we thought we knew about each other had been fundamentally altered. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of final preparations, family conversations that felt both healing and inadequate, and the surreal experience of transitioning from family disappointment to respected military intelligence officer in the span of a single phone call. Dad's behavior toward me had changed completely, but the adjustment period was complicated by the limited time we had to process years of accumulated hurt and misunderstanding before my deployment. Saturday morning brought a steady stream of official calls and secure communications as my handlers coordinated final details for the mission. Agent Stevens arrived at the house to brief me on last-minute operational security requirements and to ensure that my family understood the communication limitations that would be in place during my deployment. The sight of a federal agent in our living room treating me as a valuable intelligence asset rather than an unemployed college graduate seemed to drive home the reality of my situation for everyone involved. Dad spent the day asking careful questions about my training and preparation, clearly trying to understand what I'd been doing for the past 6 months while he thought I was job hunting. His inquiries were respectful and genuinely curious, a marked change from years of dismissive comments about my career prospects. When Agent Stevens mentioned that my linguistic capabilities were considered exceptional by agency standards, I saw Dad's expression shift from pride to something approaching awe. "Sarah," Dad said during a quiet moment in the afternoon, "can you tell me what made you decide to pursue this path? I mean, when did you realize that your language skills could be used for intelligence work?" The question carried genuine interest rather than the skeptical tone that had characterized most of his previous inquiries about my choices and motivations. The answer was complex, involving years of research into how linguistics connected to national security, months of careful consideration about whether I was suited for intelligence work, and ultimately the realization that this career path would allow me to serve my country using exactly the skills that made me unique. But explaining all of that required discussing the personal motivations that had driven me toward military service, including my desire to prove that my contributions to national security could be as valuable as traditional combat roles. I realized that modern military operations depend on cultural understanding and communication in ways that previous generations of conflicts didn't require, I explained. The ability to accurately interpret not just language, but cultural context, political nuance, and social dynamics can mean the difference between mission success and failure, between building relationships and creating enemies, between gathering critical intelligence and missing opportunities that could save lives. Miguel nodded with obvious understanding. In special operations, the guys who make the real difference are the ones who can connect with local populations, understand cultural dynamics, and gather intelligence that goes beyond what you can learn from satellites or electronic surveillance. What Sarah's describing is exactly what determines whether missions succeed or fail. Dad listened with the focused attention of someone trying to understand a field he'd never fully appreciated. "So your training wasn't just about language skills," he said. "It was about understanding how to use cultural knowledge for strategic advantage." The statement showed that he was beginning to grasp the complexity and importance of intelligence work in ways that went beyond his previous understanding of military value. Mom had been quietly managing the practical aspects of my departure, handling logistics with the efficiency that came from years of military family life. But I could see her struggling with the emotional reality of sending a daughter into danger, especially danger that she didn't fully understand and couldn't prepare for in the ways she'd learned to handle Miguel's deployments with the SEALs. "The hardest part," she said during one of our private conversations, "is that I don't know what to worry about. With Miguel, I understand the risks and the safety protocols. With your assignment, everything is classified and unfamiliar. I have to trust that your training prepared you for situations I can't even imagine. The observation highlighted one of the fundamental challenges of intelligence work. Its necessarily secretive nature meant that families couldn't be fully informed about risks, safety measures, or operational details that would help them understand and process their concerns. Mom would have to send me off knowing only that my work was important and dangerous, without the specific knowledge that might have provided comfort or context. Sunday evening arrived with the finality that military families know well: the last dinner before deployment, the last conversations before extended separation, the last moments of normal family life before operational security requirements took precedence over personal relationships. Dad had prepared my favorite meal with unusual attention to detail, clearly trying to make the evening special in ways that acknowledged both celebration of my achievements and sadness about my departure. "I want you to know," Dad said as we sat around the dinner table, "that I'm proud of you in ways I don't have words to express. Not just because of what you've accomplished, but because of who you've become despite my failure to support you properly. You found a way to serve your country that's uniquely yours, and you did it with integrity and determination that I should have recognized years ago." The words were meaningful, but they were also tinged with the sadness of recognition that came too late to change the years of damaged relationship that had preceded this moment. We were reconciling, but we were also saying goodbye, and the timing meant that this healing conversation would have to sustain us through months of separation and limited communication. Miguel raised his glass in a toast that felt different from any we'd shared as a family before. "To Sarah," he said, "who proved that there are many ways to serve your country with honor, and who chose the path that required the most courage because it was the least understood." The toast was accepted with emotion by everyone present, marking not just my departure but the fundamental change in how our family understood service, sacrifice, and the different ways that military contributions could be measured and valued. As the evening wound down and final preparations were completed, I realized that the revenge I'd imagined for years had evolved into something more complex and meaningful than simple vindication. Dad's recognition of my worth was satisfying, but the deeper satisfaction came from knowing that I'd found a way to serve that was authentically mine, regardless of whether anyone else understood or appreciated it. 6 months later, I stood in a secure briefing room in Washington, D.C., still processing the magnitude of what my team had accomplished during our deployment in Eastern Europe. The mission that had begun as my personal vindication against years of family mockery had evolved into something far more significant: an intelligence operation that had prevented what analysts were calling a potential international crisis, with implications that could have affected global stability. The debriefing with General Martinez and senior intelligence officials had taken 3 days to complete, covering every aspect of our operation from initial cultural assessment to final intelligence extraction. My linguistic capabilities had been crucial not just for translation, but for detecting subtle deceptions in multilingual negotiations, identifying cultural signals that indicated hostile intentions, and building trust with local assets who provided information that proved critical to the mission's success. "Agent Martinez," General Martinez said as the formal debriefing concluded, "your performance during this operation exceeded every expectation we had when we selected you for this assignment. The cultural analysis you provided and the intelligence you gathered will influence American foreign policy decisions for years to come. More importantly, the relationships you built and the trust you established have created ongoing intelligence opportunities that could prevent future conflicts." The commendation was professionally satisfying, but what struck me most was how naturally I'd adapted to work that challenged every capability I possessed. The languages Dad had mocked as useless party tricks had enabled me to conduct complex negotiations in 4 different languages during a single day. The cultural understanding he'd dismissed as academic nonsense had allowed me to recognize behavioral patterns that indicated deception and identify social dynamics that revealed political intentions. But the real twist came during my final meeting with General Martinez, when she revealed information that completely recontextualized everything I thought I understood about my recruitment and assignment. "Sarah," she said, reviewing my personnel file with obvious satisfaction, There's something I need to tell you about how you came to our attention initially. Your recruitment wasn't entirely coincidental. The statement caught me off guard, forcing me to reconsider assumptions I'd made about my path to intelligence work. What do you mean, General? I asked, uncertain whether I wanted to hear the answer to a question that might complicate my understanding of how I'd proven myself worthy of this assignment. 2 years ago, we received a recommendation about your capabilities from an unexpected source, she continued, pulling a document from my file that I'd never seen before. Someone with extensive military experience contacted our recruitment division specifically to recommend you for linguistic intelligence work. They provided detailed information about your language capabilities, your analytical thinking, and your potential value for cultural assessment work. My mind raced through possibilities, trying to identify who might have recognized my potential for intelligence work and taken the initiative to recommend me to military recruiters. The timing suggested it had happened during my final year of college, before I'd made any official contact with government agencies or expressed interest in military service. General Martinez handed me the recommendation letter, and I felt my world shift as I recognized the official letterhead and signature. The recommendation had come from Colonel James Martinez, my father, written 18 months before his phone call from General Martinez, at a time when he was still publicly dismissing my language skills as worthless and impractical. The letter was comprehensive and professionally detailed, describing my linguistic capabilities with accuracy that indicated extensive observation and research. Dad had documented not just the 9 languages I spoke fluently, but specific examples of my cultural analysis abilities, instances of my strategic thinking under pressure, and observations about my character and potential that he'd never shared with me directly. Your father's recommendation was instrumental in bringing you to our attention, General Martinez explained. He described capabilities that perfectly matched what we'd been seeking for specialized intelligence operations. When our recruiters contacted you, it was based largely on his assessment of your potential value for exactly the kind of work you've now proven exceptionally capable of performing. The revelation was staggering in its implications. While Dad had been publicly mocking my choices and dismissing my capabilities, he'd been privately advocating for my recruitment into exactly the kind of military service that would utilize my strengths most effectively. The years of seeming disappointment and criticism had been accompanied by behind-the-scenes recognition and support that I'd known nothing about. But why? I asked, struggling to reconcile this information with years of perceived rejection and dismissal. If he recognized my potential for intelligence work, why did he spend so much time making me feel like my choices were worthless? General Martinez's expression softened with understanding. Military families often struggle with non-traditional forms of service. Your father understood your capabilities, but he also knew that intelligence work requires psychological resilience and independence that can't be taught. His criticism, however misguided it might have seemed, was preparing you for a career where external validation would be limited and personal confidence would be essential. The explanation reframed years of painful family interactions in ways that were both healing and complicated. Dad's dismissive comments hadn't been expressions of genuine disappointment. They'd been poorly executed attempts to prepare me for a career path he'd already identified as ideal for my capabilities. His mockery had been his way of testing and strengthening the psychological resilience that intelligence work would require. The irony, General Martinez continued, is that his recommendation letter described you as someone who could succeed in intelligence work specifically because you'd developed independence from external approval and confidence in your own judgment, despite family pressure to pursue different paths. He understood that those qualities, combined with your technical capabilities, would make you exceptionally valuable for the kind of work where recognition is limited and personal motivation is crucial. As I drove home from that final briefing, carrying commendations and recognition that I couldn't share with anyone outside the intelligence community, I realized that the ultimate twist in my story wasn't about proving Dad wrong. It was about discovering that he'd been supporting my path toward meaningful service even while appearing to oppose it, and that his apparent disappointment had actually been preparation for exactly the career that would allow me to serve my country most effectively. The revenge I'd sought for years of mockery had transformed into gratitude for a father who'd recognized my potential before I understood it myself, and who'd found a way to prepare me for challenges I hadn't even known I would face. Sometimes the people who seem to doubt you the most are actually the ones working hardest to ensure you succeed. Thank you for being here. Her journey was heavy, but it led her back to herself. Watch another powerful story by clicking on the left, and don't forget to subscribe for more voices that deserve to be heard.